They thought that young people had an idea of how they might be able to cash in on it at some time, so they were just sort of letting them do what they want. Lasted for a few years, and we kind of snuck in there. So,
what happens when a life of sharp wit, irony, and perfection hides a secret too intimate to face? For more than half a century, Steely Dan's music was the soundtrack of cynicism and brilliance, meticulously crafted, endlessly analyzed, and guarded by walls of mystery. But behind the sarcasm and studio walls lived another story. A story no lyric revealed, no interview uncovered. Every question about his private life was dodged with a smirk. Every rumor drowned in layers of sound. Until now. At 77, Donald Fagen finally breaks the silence. And what he confesses about his wife doesn't just rewrite the Steely Dan myth. It changes everything we thought we knew about the man behind it. This isn't just a revelation. It's the unmasking of a truth he has kept hidden in plain sight for decades. But what exactly did he reveal that leaves fans stunned and the industry shaken? For decades, Steely Dan existed in a world of controlled chaos, a band fueled by perfectionism, sarcasm, and the brilliance of Donald Fagen and the late Walter Becker. Their music was slick, intellectual, and elusive, never offering too much of themselves. Fans dissected their lyrics, scholars analyzed their chords, but the men behind the sound? They were enigmas, and nowhere was that silence more deafening than in the private life of Donald Fagen. At 77, Fagen had carried secrets longer than some of his fans had been alive. His wife, Libby Titus, was a name known in whispers, a singer-songwriter herself, a woman who had moved through the music world with quiet influence, but always in his shadow. Fagen never gave much away, refusing to indulge journalists who pried into his personal life. For him, the music was the story, and the rest was none of the world's business. But time, as it often does, stripped away the defenses. The confession came quietly at first, in a rare interview. He was no longer the sharp-tongued, caustic figure rolling his eyes at questions he deemed beneath him. Instead, he was contemplative, almost tender. "I owe her more than anyone knows," he admitted, a sentence that landed like a thunderclap. For 50 years, fans had been speculating about the women behind the cryptic verses, the references that seemed to drip with both adoration and disdain. Was Deacon Blues secretly about her? Did she shape the mood of Aja? What made the moment so explosive wasn't just that Fagen finally spoke her name, it was the implication that she had always been there, woven into the DNA of Steely Dan's story. The woman who had lived with his genius, tolerated his moods, and endured the whirlwind of fame had never once stepped into the spotlight willingly. She was both muse and shield, silently carrying the weight of his silences. But why now? Why, after all these years, had Fagen chosen to finally speak? Perhaps it was age, or the recognition that silence was its own betrayal. Or perhaps it was the scandals that had swirled for decades, rumors of betrayals, of bitterness, of nights that ended in chaos. Whatever the reason, his decision to speak shattered the mythology of Steely Dan's untouchable distance. The world suddenly saw Fagen not as the aloof architect of sardonic jazz rock, but as a man confessing, too late perhaps, that his greatest secret was love. And that love had been tested by shadows darker than the music ever revealed. Libby Titus was never just the wife. To reduce her to that would be a crime against history. Born Elizabeth Jurist, she had her own journey long before she ever crossed paths with Donald Fagen. She was a singer, a songwriter, and an undeniable force of creativity in the New York music scene of the late 60s and 70s. She collaborated with legends, held her own among giants, and carried a kind of charisma that couldn't be ignored. But to the outside world, she was an enigma. She avoided interviews, rarely spoke about her private life, and when she did appear, it was fleeting. Never enough to satisfy the curiosity of those who wondered who exactly could tether someone like Fagen. She didn't need the spotlight. She had her own glow. It was that quiet strength that drew him in. At a time when Steely Dan was ascending into stardom, tangled in recording sessions that stretched into the early hours of the morning, filled with endless retakes and impossible demands, she was the calm in the storm. While the band lived on cigarettes, sarcasm, and cynicism, she offered something different: a home, a refuge, a reminder that the world outside the studio still existed. But her influence was not passive. Insiders whispered that some of Steely Dan's most intimate and haunting lines were born in the shadows of their conversations. When Fagen wrote about disillusionment, about fleeting love and quiet betrayals, those closest to him knew she was the ghost in the margins. She was both his sanctuary and his mirror, forcing him to face the uglier truths about himself. Still, to be tied to Steely Dan was to live in a world where nothing was ever simple. Fame followed him, and by extension, her. She watched as women threw themselves at him, as the temptations of the road pressed against the walls of their marriage. The public never saw it, but she carried scars of nights filled with silence, of arguments sparked by the pressures of a man consumed by his art. And yet, she stayed. Not because she was weak, but because she saw the man behind the music. Donald Fagen, stripped of his wit and sarcasm, was someone only she understood. And that mystery, that quiet resilience, made her not just a figure in his life, but the woman who changed everything. Steely Dan's rise was unlike any other. While other bands basked in the glow of fame, Fagen and Becker operated behind a velvet curtain of irony and detachment. They were elusive, refusing to tour for years, creating instead an aura of mystery that only fueled their cult-like following. Fans consumed the records like sacred texts, parsing each lyric for meaning, each chord for intent. But behind that curtain was a world far less glamorous. Studio sessions that stretched for months. Musicians fired and rehired at the whim of perfection. Nights of paranoia, fueled by substances and exhaustion. And through it all, Libby was there. She wasn't in the studio barking at engineers or demanding another take, but she was the one waiting when the doors finally opened, when Fagen stumbled out, drained, hollow-eyed, and unreachable. To be married to Steely Dan was to accept absence as part of the contract. He was there, but never fully. His mind was always elsewhere, on the song that wasn't finished, on the chord progression that wasn't perfect, on the lyric that still didn't land. She lived in the shadows of genius, and the shadows are never kind. Rumors swirled of affairs, of distance, of moments where the marriage almost crumbled under the weight of fame. Yet the scandals that whispered around Steely Dan never touched her directly. She refused to play the game, never feeding tabloids or confirming suspicions. Still, those closest to the band knew the cost. They saw the cracks that fame carved into their foundation. They saw her silence not as ignorance, but as survival. By the late 70s, when Steely Dan reached their zenith with Aja and then began their slow retreat from the spotlight, Libby's role became even more vital. Fame was fleeting, critics were ruthless, and Fagen's insecurities often gnawed at him. She was his anchor, even when he tried to push her away. Behind the velvet curtain, behind the records that critics hailed as masterpieces, there was always the woman no one spoke of, the woman who kept the chaos from consuming him. And now, at 77, Donald Fagen finally admitted what insiders had known all along. Without her, there may never have been a Steely Dan, as the world remembers it. In the dazzling glow of Steely Dan's fame, Donald Fagen's personal life was anything but straightforward. The spotlight brought both adoration and temptation, and like so many artists of his generation, Fagen was caught in the push and pull between loyalty and desire. To the world, his marriage to Libby Titus was stable, even unremarkable compared to the chaos of the rock and roll scene. But behind closed doors, the reality was darker, messier, and far more scandalous than anyone suspected. Whispers trailed the band everywhere they went. Tour buses and hotel lobbies became backdrops for fleeting encounters. Groupies followed like moths to a flame, and while Becker drowned himself in the darker corners of excess, Fagen played a subtler game. He was too clever, too cautious to let the press catch him, but those within the inner circle saw the cracks. Nights where he disappeared, excuses that didn't quite hold, and a silence at home that grew heavier with each passing year. For Libby, love was never blind. She knew. She always knew. Yet she bore it with an unsettling quietness, never confronting the world, never allowing her dignity to be dismantled by tabloids hungry for blood. Her silence was not acceptance, it was survival. She loved him, yes, but she also loved herself enough to remain whole. And so, she endured the double life, carving her place in his world without ever letting him erase her own. But the strain was undeniable. His absences grew longer, his returns colder. Fagen was a man torn between two selves, the one who craved stability and the one who thrived in chaos. And in trying to live both, he risked losing everything. His marriage was not the steady foundation fans imagined. It was a house of glass, constantly threatening to shatter. What makes his late-life confession so damning is not just that he admitted his love, but that he admitted his failings. That behind the carefully constructed image of the cool, untouchable musician was a man who betrayed the very person who shielded him from destruction. A man who built his career on irony, while his personal life unraveled in secrecy. It wasn't just love in the shadows, it was a double life, one that nearly consumed them both. Every marriage has its breaking points, and for Donald Fagen and Libby Titus, there were many. Theirs was not a union free of drama. It was a constant negotiation between love and resentment, forgiveness and fury. And when scandals began to leak into public view, the cracks were impossible to ignore. The most infamous story circulated in hushed tones, rarely acknowledged by Fagen himself. In the early 80s, insiders claimed he spiraled into a period of reckless indulgence. Booze, substances, and women all colliding in a blur of decadence. It was during this time that one incident nearly ended his marriage for good. He was said to have been caught, quite literally, in the arms of another. A hotel hallway, a whispered confrontation, and Libby's quiet exit. The press never got the full story, but the damage was done. Friends later recalled that she considered leaving him then, finally cutting the cord on years of secrecy and silence. But she didn't. Instead, she retreated deeper into her own life, focusing on her own music and her family. For her, survival meant choosing when to engage and when to withdraw. And in those years, she withdrew almost completely. But scandals weren't confined to infidelity alone. Fagen's temper was notorious, sharp, cutting, and sometimes explosive. There were rumors of fights that turned vicious, of words hurled like weapons, of nights that ended in slammed doors and shattered trust. Libby, by all accounts, bore the brunt of it, though she never let the public see her bruises. Not physical, but emotional, etched deep into the fabric of her marriage. These scandals could have destroyed them, and for most couples, they would have. But somehow, they didn't. Somehow, the marriage endured. not because it was perfect, but because it was bound by something deeper than scandal. Love, yes, but also history, and perhaps even guilt. At 77, Fagen admitted what no headline ever could, that he almost lost her 100 times, and each time she chose to stay. Not because he deserved it, but because she understood him in a way no one else ever could. That understanding kept them tethered, even when the world tried to tear them apart. To outsiders, Steely Dan's music was the product of genius, pure and simple. But those who lived within the orbit of Donald Fagen knew the truth. Genius is fragile and often self-destructive. There were moments, many of them, when the music almost stopped. When the band's perfectionism turned toxic, when egos clashed, when exhaustion threatened to silence the sound forever. And in those moments, one person became the quiet savior: Libby Titus. She was not an engineer, nor a producer, nor a session musician. Yet her presence often determined whether the music continued. When Fagen spiraled into self-doubt, obsessing over a chord or a lyric until it consumed him, she was the one who pulled him back. When his temper threatened to alienate everyone in the room, she was the one who calmed the storm. There is one story, told quietly by a studio insider, that illustrates her influence. It was during the recording of Gaucho, a notoriously troubled album. Sessions dragged on for months, costs ballooned, tempers flared. At one point, Fagen threatened to scrap an entire track, convinced it was unworthy. He stormed out, disappearing for hours. When he returned, the song was recorded, because Libby had found him, talked him down, and reminded him why he started writing it in the first place. The song survived, and so did the album. Her role was never credited, her name never listed in liner notes, but without her, the music might have ended long before the band's legacy was secured. She was the ghost in the studio, unseen but essential, keeping the machine running when it should have collapsed. At 77, Fagen finally admitted it. She saved me. She saved the music. More than once. For a man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind irony and detachment, those words carried the weight of a confession decades overdue. The world had always seen Steely Dan as the product of two men, Fagen and Becker. But behind the velvet curtain, behind the scandals and the genius, there was always a third presence, a woman who refused credit, who never demanded recognition, but who quietly shaped the very music that defined a generation. By the mid-'80s, the world believed Steely Dan was untouchable. They had built a reputation as perfectionists, crafting records so polished they seemed immune to time. But behind the brilliance, there was decay. Walter Becker sank into isolation, weighed down by addiction and tragedy. Donald Fagen, meanwhile, found himself spiraling in different ways, consumed by paranoia, bitterness, and a gnawing fear that the magic might finally slip away. For Libby, the downfall wasn't sudden. She had seen the signs long before the public did. The endless nights, the scathing self-criticism, the way Donald paced the floor like a man at war with his own shadow. His wit, once charming, curdled into cynicism. He lashed out more often, withdrew for days, and carried the stench of exhaustion everywhere he went. Success had turned toxic, eating away at the very man it was supposed to elevate. The collapse of Steely Dan in 1981 was painted in the press as a creative break, a time for the duo to recharge. But insiders knew better. It was a breakdown, plain and simple. Becker retreated, and Fagen, left adrift, plunged into a depression so deep that even Libby feared he wouldn't emerge. His solo debut, The Nightfly, was hailed as brilliant, but behind the applause was a man barely holding himself together. The world celebrated the album as a triumph, but at home, Libby saw the truth. sleepless nights, unfinished songs, and a husband who no longer recognized the man in the mirror. Fame had given him everything and nothing all at once. It was Libby who picked up the fragments, who forced him to eat, to sleep, to keep moving. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a caretaker to a man unraveling under the weight of his own genius. The downfall of Steely Dan wasn't just about the band. It was about the cost of brilliance. And while fans waited for their return, Libby was the one holding together the shattered pieces of a life the world thought was glamorous, but was, in truth, collapsing from within. With fame came rumors, an endless tide of whispers that blurred the line between fact and fiction. Donald Fagen and Libby Titus were no strangers to it. Some stories were laughable, others cut too close to the bone. For years, tabloids hinted at betrayals, affairs, and explosive fights behind closed doors. Were they all lies? Not entirely. The most persistent rumor was that Fagen had carried on a long, quiet affair with a woman tied to the New York music scene. The story resurfaced again and again, never confirmed, never denied. Libby never addressed it publicly, but her silence spoke volumes. Friends hinted she knew, that she had known all along, and that her decision to stay was not forgiveness, but something more complicated. A recognition that love is rarely simple, and loyalty doesn't always mean blindness. Then there were whispers about her own entanglements. Some claimed she too sought comfort elsewhere, tired of the long absences, the bitterness, the constant shadow of fame. No proof was ever found, but in the world of Steely Dan, where secrets thrived and truths were buried beneath layers of irony, anything seemed possible. The betrayals, real or imagined, hung over them like storm clouds. They were never spoken of in public, but behind the scenes, they nearly tore the marriage apart. Yet, somehow, the bond endured. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps it was history. Or perhaps it was the realization that despite the betrayals, no one else could ever understand them in the same way. At 77, when Donald finally spoke, he didn't deny the scandals. He didn't excuse them either. Instead, he offered something far more damning. "I wasn't easy to love, and she loved me anyway." Those words didn't erase the betrayals, but they revealed a truth that tabloids never could. That love is not defined by perfection, but by endurance. When Steely Dan finally returned to the stage after years of silence, fans erupted in joy. The band that had built a cult-like following in the 70s was suddenly alive again, their songs echoing across sold-out arenas. But while the world celebrated the comeback, few noticed the quiet figure in the wings, Libby Titus. She never demanded attention, never sought applause, but her presence was undeniable to those who knew where to look. At rehearsals, she hovered discreetly, offering small reassurances when Donald's nerves threatened to undo him. On performance nights, she sat just out of sight, her expression unreadable as the man she had anchored for decades transformed under the spotlight. For Fagen, those performances were not just about the music, they were survival. Each show was a battle against age, against exhaustion, against the ghosts of his own perfectionism. And each time, Libby was there, grounding him. She wasn't the muse in the abstract sense anymore. She was the quiet force ensuring he didn't collapse under the weight of his own legend. There's one performance, whispered about among insiders, that stands out. A night when Donald nearly walked off stage mid-show, frustrated by a technical glitch, convinced the audience could sense his flaws. It was Libby who stopped him. She slipped backstage during the break, looked him in the eye, and told him the truth no one else dared. "They're not here for perfection. They're here for you." He went back out. He finished the show. and the crowd roared as if nothing had gone wrong. Her presence was not in the music, not in the lyrics, not in the applause. It was in the silences between notes, in the stability that allowed him to keep playing when he wanted to give up. She was not part of the show, but without her, there might not have been a show at all. By the time the curtain fell on their final tour, Donald Fagen was no longer the untouchable figure of the 70s. He was older, wearier, but finally willing to admit what had been true all along, that the woman who stood in silence at the edge of the stage was as much a part of Steely Dan's story as any chord or lyric ever written. For decades, Donald Fagen was the enigma at the center of Steely Dan, sharp, aloof, wrapped in sarcasm that could slice through steel. He hid behind lyrics thick with irony, behind interviews that gave nothing away, behind a cultivated distance that kept the public guessing. But at 77, the armor finally cracked. In a rare interview, he was asked the question no one expected him to answer. "What about your wife?" For a moment, he went silent. The man who always had a clever retort seemed suddenly stripped of words. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "She wasn't just my wife," he said. "She was the reason any of this was possible." People think Steely Dan was built on obsession, on perfection. But without her, there wouldn't have been anything to perfect. It wasn't a confession of scandal, though scandal lingered in the margins of their story. It wasn't an apology, though unspoken regrets filled the pauses between his sentences. It was something else, something far more intimate. For the first time, Donald acknowledged that the myth of Steely Dan was incomplete without her. He spoke of how she endured the sharp edges of his personality, how she pulled him back from the brink when the music threatened to consume him. He admitted the betrayals, though he didn't give them names, and said only that, "I didn't make it easy for her, but she stayed, and I owe her everything." The truth he revealed wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of romantic tale fans might have imagined. It was messier, more human, more raw. It was the truth of two people bound not by perfection, but by resilience. A love story that survived the grind of fame, the sting of rumors, and the collapse of an empire built on sound. As he reached the end of the interview, he leaned back, almost as if speaking had lifted a weight he had carried too long. "People think Steely Dan was my greatest work," he said. "They're wrong. It was her. Loving her. That was the real work of my life." For a man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind metaphor, irony, and riddles, it was the most direct statement he had ever made. No riddles, no evasions. Just the simple, devastating truth. At 77, Donald Fagen finally let the world see what had been there all along. That behind the velvet curtain of genius and scandal, the quiet presence of Libby Titus was not just part of his story. She was the story. If the silence has lasted this long, should we accept it as final? Or wonder why it was kept at all? At 77, Steely Dan finally opens up about his wife, but the weight of his words depends on how we choose to listen. Before the years erase the echoes, remember, some truths are not meant to stay hidden. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.